All right. Uh, Thank you for that. Actually, I appreciate the detail, Director Bonham. I believe that there is a great deal of opportunity for natural resources to play a major role in GHG reduction, and it sounds as if there's quite a good process set up for doing that, for figuring out the outcomes. And
yes, so I expect to announce the awardees in April, which will mean we've done all this in 10 months.
All right. Let's move on to forestry and fire protection. We'll do them all and then questions. Okay. Forestry and fire protection, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair, members of the committee. Ken Pimlott, Director for CAL FIRE. With me today is Dwayne Shintaku, our Deputy Director for Resource Management. The governor's budget proposes $42 million in greenhouse gas reduction funds into a variety of existing CAL FIRE, Department of Forestry and Fire Protection resource management program areas. The biggest and largest one is approximately $18 million into the urban and community forestry program. And the remainder are spread across demonstration state forest and cooperative wildland research, fuels reduction using existing vegetation management and fuel treatment program in forested areas, reforestation and pre-commercial or thinning activities, particularly reforestation after fire in many of the burned areas across the state. Funding for the department's involvement in the Forest Legacy Program, conservation easements, working forest conservation easements across the state, and then continued implementation of the Forest Practice Program and Forest Pest Control Program, in particular supporting landowners engaged in long-term environmental impact reports, programmatic impact reports as part of the timber harvest process. Letters of invite have gone out to all of the prospective applicants. The department started with a concept proposal phase, reviewed, processed those, and then invited final invite letters or proposals out to those projects that we felt closely matched and were most appropriate for greenhouse gas reduction project consideration. Again, the deadline is at the end of April for receiving those proposals, and then the department will be reviewing those in the next several months for final approval and allocation by me and out. Projects must have a complete, clear, and defensible quantification of greenhouse gas emission reduction. Those highly competitive projects will have substantial levels of collaboration with partners, and they need to demonstrate strategic planning, provide public benefits, and have community support. Clearly, projects must assure the emission reduction benefits will be realized and long-lasting. This will be demonstrated by a project having a long-term monitoring, emission reduction trends, the presence of long-term forest management plan, history of good forest stewardship on the land and good practices by the landowner, and the presence of land use restrictions such as conservation easement, timber production zone, or other covenants that can ensure us that this land is going to be managed and maintained as a forest landscape. Essentially, overall, we are looking and investing in projects that provide that biggest bang for the buck, that provide many co-benefits and accomplish several of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund program objectives, including forest health, reducing wildfire emissions, and improved carbon sequestration. So addressing the 4 questions, starting with the first question, how will the department prioritize the use of working conservation easements? The Forest Legacy Program puts a high priority on those high-risk landscapes that are subject to conversion to a non-forest land use. So we'll certainly be prioritizing those first, but certainly leaving the door open into the future for other viable conservation easement projects that meet the goal of the program. Question 2, the department has a dedicated funding source for fuel reduction through the state responsibility area fee. How is that used in conjunction with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and that program? We have built, essentially similar to Fish and Wildlife, 2 grant programs in the space of the last 10 months. One-time funding in the current year out of SRA fire prevention P funds, grant program building at the same time as greenhouse gas. They're being earmarked for different site-specific areas. For example, the Fire Prevention Fund is targeting those areas where we have habitable structures, those individuals paying the fee, in the particularly urban interface areas where we need to treat fuels, provide defensible space, education, et cetera, to help protect communities and protect forest land and other wildlands. Targeting the greenhouse gas reduction fund projects to more forested landscapes and targeting the kinds of projects, obviously priority where we can secure carbon sequestration and really have an influence on forest health and protecting forest stands from fire. Question 3, the Department of Finance required the department to allocate all of the urban forestry program funding to disadvantaged communities. Clearly, across the state, the urban forestry program had the best benefit using EnviroScreen as the tool for providing greenhouse gas funds to disadvantaged communities. And so the program, with the administration's direction, provided those funds through our grant process to disadvantaged communities. Question 4, wouldn't the Wildlife Conservation Board's forest program, which is the state's expert in conservation easements, particularly those across department boundaries and include legislative advisory committee, be a more appropriate funding agent for the non-urban forestry grant program? The Wildlife Conservation Board has been an absolute strong ally in the department securing funding with our Forest Legacy Program conservation easements. We have been working with the board for many years now in successful implementation of this program. However, it's important to consider the fact that the conservation easements under the Forest Legacy Program require that lands manage and be part of active forest management. Forest management requires the expertise of a registered professional forester in the state of California to engage in, provide advice, and practice forestry in California. The law requires that all foresters be registered and require a certain level of training and experience. So engaging that experience so that we can advise landowners and build criteria in these conservation easements that secure long-term active forest management that meet the state's goals for forest management and criteria under the Forest Practice Act. Does not, however, preclude the ongoing relationship with the board as we work through securing these conservation easements. With that, open to questions.
I'm sure we'll come back to you. Okay. Let's go on to Cal Recycle.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. Ken DeRosa, Chief Deputy Director with Cal Recycle. Pleasure to be here. Senator Pavley, Senator Nielsen, good to see you. We're pleased to be here to talk about the extraordinary and excellent work of the dedicated men and women of Cal Recycle that I have the great privilege of working with every day. I'll address your questions throughout my remarks, but to lead it off, we believe that, and we recognize that this is tied directly to greenhouse gas emissions, our organics grant program, by expanding recycling, manufacturing, and composting anaerobic digestion infrastructure in the state of California. In doing so, we reduce methane emissions associated with organics in landfills, and through our fibers, plastics, and glass program, by increasing recycled content, we reduce CO2 emissions from fossil fuel production and extraction and the use of virgin materials in manufacturing. As you all may know, organic materials represent about 1/3 of what goes into the waste stream. And removing that material from the landfill will significantly move the state towards achieving the objectives of the 75% recycling goal articulated under AB 341, while at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And Cal Recycle received $25 million in the 14-15 Budget Act. $20 million of that is designated for grants. $5 million of that is designated for loans. 15-16 proposes a similar distribution and funding level. Just to talk briefly about our organics grant program, that's $15 million of the 20. The solicitation for that was highly oversubscribed. We received 44 eligible applicants seeking $108 million. And admittedly, many good projects weren't funded. About 24 of the projects received passing scores. Ultimately, we awarded 5 grants. Under the fiber, plastic, and glass grants, that was $5 million. We received 10 eligible applications for $18 million. That was also oversubscribed, and we ultimately awarded 3 of those grants. All 8 grant projects benefit disadvantaged communities. They do so by providing economic benefit, providing employment opportunities, to the extent that a project is diverting waste from a landfill that is located in a disadvantaged community. There is a benefit to the community in doing that. To the extent that the project improves air and water quality, there is a benefit to disadvantaged communities in that regard. And also one element of one of the grants is a food rescue component. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And that has a direct benefit to disadvantaged communities as well. The evaluation and scoring process was very complicated. Each project varies, and we needed to carefully verify and in some cases recalculate the tonnage of GHG emission reductions to expect. And as a result, it took several months to evaluate and score all of the applications. However, we did award those grants in November of 2014. We've worked closely, and as has been articulated by other agencies in front of you today, we work closely with, and we continue to work closely with the Air Resources Board. And they have published several emission reduction factors that applicants can use. Even then, many applicant projects didn't fit the exact pathways of these factors, and so we worked with ARB to establish a process in our first cycle for reviewing and approving the use of alternative methodologies. And we feel very confident that we have identified those very well, and these projects are going to reach their targets. Wanted to correct an item that's in the agenda relative to what our projections indicate in terms of emission reductions. Our first-year projections are somewhere in the neighborhood of 280,000 tons per year of material diverted and 213,000 metric tons of CO2 emission reductions per year. The 10-year cumulative projection is 2.2 million GHG, not the first year. We also want to speak a little bit to the cost effectiveness. We believe that the average award per ton of greenhouse gas emission reductions over 10 years is going to be about $8.76 per ton of GHG emissions. And that's under the organics program, and about $10.66 per tons of GHG emission reductions under the fiber, plastic, and grants. So there's a certain cost effectiveness in how we're doing this. There's a question relative to our loan program. That is currently in process right now. We're anticipating awarding those loans in April. But we do want to point out that at this point we've only received 2 loan applications. We speculate that the reason for that is we're beginning our next cycle of the grant programs, and so there's been so much interest in the upcoming grant cycle that people may be just biding their time and waiting for that. Anecdotally, free money is always better. Right, so there may be more interest in the grants because of that as well. We'll continue to examine that. I want to speak a little to our process. After the first round of grants, we took a very close analysis and looked at how it went and what worked. And in fact, just last week on March 19th, we held a workshop to talk about the new aspects, the new scoring criteria, the differences in our grant program going forward. We think in order for it to be successful, in order to continue to evolve, it has to be very dynamic. There's got to be a lot of back and forth. And to speak to some earlier comments about openness and transparency, we're very public with our process. Our workshops are open. All of our criteria is publicly open. There's an active engagement with our grantees and our grantee applicants. To speak to our next cycle of grants for the 15-16 budget, we'll be releasing the notice of funding application in late April or May. Those applications will be due the summer of June and July, and we anticipate awards in December, again, giving us sufficient time to really look closely at those applications. Just to touch on a couple of projects, one in particular I think that's worth noting is a project. It's in 2 locations. It's in Tulare County, but also in Fresno. It's Fresno Metro Ministry. The Tulare aspect of it is an anaerobic digester. The Fresno Metro Ministry project is expected to secure 65 tons on an annual basis of food rescue from retail establishments, grocery stores, bakeries, that can then be submitted to food closets. And we're very optimistic about this project. They have a very good history, and I think that kind of exemplifies some of the positive things that are happening with this grant program. And thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to CFDA, and then we'll have questions, no doubt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jim Houston, Undersecretary at the Department of Food and Agriculture. We have three programs. I'll start with SWEEP, talk about the dairy digesters, and then the fuels program, and I'll answer the question about SWEEP while I'm talking about Sweet. So statewide water efficiency program appropriated $10 million last year to fund water irrigation treatment and distribution systems that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We utilized the authority of the Environmental Farming Act and the Environmental Farming Act Science Advisory Panel as sort of our first filter to evaluate the proposals and help set up guidelines. We've worked extensively with researchers at the CSU and both UC in terms of verification to make sure that the upfront work was done. So we had 2 rounds of funding, and we sort of learned lessons from the first round. The first round, we had 132 applicants totaling $5 million. We awarded 82 projects of $3.2 million, and after going back and talking with our stakeholders and academics, we realized that there were ways that we could improve it. First is more education to the growers about the need to document and verify the greenhouse gas component. As you can imagine, that's not something a lot of growers are particularly familiar with, the sort of nuances of that, and so it was really helpful doing that outreach. And then the second was that we raised the cap on the award. The first one was only $50,000, and the second one was $150,000. And so our second round was much more popular, received 321 applicants. We were able to award 74 projects totaling 6.2. So today we have 156 projects out there totaling $9.5 million. In answer to the first question about sort of where this all went, in round one, about 48% went to soil moisture monitoring systems for better scheduling of irrigation. 54%, by the way, some of these did multiple things, so it's going to add up to more than 100%. 54% involved micro irrigation and drip irrigation systems to replace flood and furrow irrigation. 20% had energy efficiency pumps, which switched from diesel to electric or solar. 27% use evapotranspiration data, which is sort of monitoring how the water goes off, to better facilitate irrigation scheduling. 14% use variable frequency drive pumps, so for more efficient pumping of the water. 10% use low pressure irrigation systems, and 44% used multiple techniques. So to date, so the acres contributing to savings were 8,847 from round one. The total water savings were 8,942 acre feet, which is about enough to fill 116,550 swimming pools, or 2.9 billion 1-gallon bottles of water. I don't know, I like these little things. The total water savings over the 15 years of practice are 134,000 acre feet. The total GHG savings are 2,410 tons per year equivalent, which is about 507 passenger vehicles. And over the life of the project, we expect to save 36,149 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So how we monitor, or how we determine that, there were 4 components of the program to make the determination. The first was a technical review of the estimates and calculations that we contracted with UC and CSU to evaluate the estimated water savings. The technical reviewers assessed the applications, the project designs and budgets to determine whether the calculations were correct. The third was that we required the applicants to include documentation that would verify their reductions, and then, or that would support their reductions, and then we have a verification component, so we've contracted with the resource conservation districts to do on-the-field verification of the GHG reductions. So we do feel very confident that the outreach that we've done, especially between round one and round two, really learning those lessons, that all that upfront work is really going to help in the verification and the solidification. So the next and biggest one is the Dairy Digester Program, which was $12 million in 14-15 and another 12 in 15-16. That was 2 phases. Phase 1 is the actual grant process. Phase 2 is a research component. So phase 1 was $11.1 million. We had been engaged for many years with what's called the Fed State Digester Working Group, which has been a really successful partnership between our department, our sister agencies, local air pollution control districts, local water boards, and the Fed in terms of figuring out what are some of the challenges for digesters. So they were very helpful. We had a technical working group that also helped evaluate and set up criteria for the proposals. So phase one, we had 12 applicants, totaling $27 million. We're still in the process of evaluating those, and we expect to make announcements in June about the projects that are awarded and get the money out to those projects in July. The way that we are determining the greenhouse gas reductions for the dairy digester program, all applicants are required to use the California Air Resources Board compliance offset protocol. Livestock projects, which is also referred to as the CARB livestock protocol, to determine what their base greenhouse gas emissions were, and then their projected reductions for the projects. Applicants were required to provide calculations in 3 formats: the total annual greenhouse gas reductions, the greenhouse reductions per year, greenhouse reductions per unit of energy corrected milk produced by dairy operations, and then greenhouse gas reductions per dollar of CDFA grant money invested. And projects funded through phase one are required to submit their greenhouse gas reductions to CDFA for 10 years so that we're keeping track of the life of the project. And then last is our alternative and renewable fuels program, which is a little bit unique because what it is designed to do is when we get these alternative fuels going, there needs to be some sort of commercial viability to them, which means the consumer has to be protected in terms of knowing that the fuel is going to work in their car, that it's not going to tear apart the engine, that it's not going to blow up the car, those types of things, their viscosity and flashpoint. And so we need to do all the tests and have specific standards so that people that are out in the field that are checking these things know what to look for. Many of these fuels require specialized equipment, and that's sort of what the bulk of the funds go to, is setting up the lab. So there are no technical required GHG reductions from this particular program. What's going to happen is once these fuels come on board, then we have the carbon intensity of the alternative fuel and the associated net carbon displacement of the traditional fuels will be quantified using CARB's fuel pathway carbon intensity matrix. And so once these fuels come on board, we have a couple in the pipeline. DME would be one of them, renewable natural gas. There's a couple others that the chemists in our department would have to tell you the names of. But all of these are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so once the fuels are there and we have data on how much they're being utilized, it's a relatively easy calculation to discover the displacement and what the greenhouse gas savings were. But without this program, these fuels would not be able to be sold commercially because they wouldn't meet the standards and they wouldn't have any standards to meet. And then the last, I'll answer the second question, which is what else we've looked at. And the only other thing that we sort of explored and what we're sort of in the process of doing now was farm management practices, looking at nitrogen and those use, looking at the soils. But the research just isn't there right now to verify the reductions, in terms of the greenhouse. It's one of those things where we have a sense of it. There's some research, but it's just not quite to the level that's necessary for ARB verification. And so we're in the process of working towards that, identifying gaps. The Healthy Soils Initiative that was announced in the January budget is part of that process. And so we hope to identify research gaps and have a proposal in the future that looks at farm management practices. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let me open it to questions from the committee. Senator Pavley and then Senator Nielsen. Yeah.
Director Pimlott, the fuel reduction, how are we doing on that, phasing in the fee money and actually making progress getting that fuel reduced? I know I saw CC folks in here today. I've been meeting with them in the office whenever I could. I know they're helping you on that.
We're actually hitting that on several fronts. The department's fire prevention program and fuels treatment activities are funded directly. So we have our conservation camp crews and vegetation management staff out actively working on projects. Part of it is going to the Conservation Corps for additional projects within the state responsibility area that meet the criteria. And then this year had a one-time opportunity because of the governor's executive order for the drought that we've just put out 83 projects to almost $10 million across the state in almost every county that has state responsibility area for a variety of projects, from working with fire districts, fire safe councils, and other local and appropriate cooperators. And it's everything from fuels treatment, goat grazing, public education, all aimed at going right back out on the ground and working with those folks that won fire safe councils who were very effective at getting work done collaboratively on the ground and right back out where the fee's coming from those folks that have habitable structures in the wildland.
I want to tell you, I appreciate too, there's a focus this year on the marijuana growers. It's a huge problem. We've been working on a special pilot project with Water Board up in Shasta and Butte counties. But I know that that you folks are engaged and the Department of Fish and Wildlife is engaged, and we appreciate that. That is quite a problem. Even the legal growers, but worse, the illegal growers. So.
We're certainly a committed partner with Fish and Wildlife and the water boards, particularly where the environmental damage results from removal of forested tree canopies and other issues. So we'll absolutely a partner in that, and we'll continue to be.
Senator Pavlik.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mr. Bonham, I appreciate you might have actually read AB 32 because you use the words that I always keep looking for. GHG reductions have to be real, permanent, quantifiable, and verifiable. You had suggested that your grantees are going to be responsible for the long-term monitoring in order, is that, if I heard you correctly, in order to do just that, right? Permanent. How is that going to work? Is there a funding stream? I mean, I want someone to do that, so I was intrigued with how you set that up.
Especially the RCDs, if I may.
Well, that's on the, yes, on the, and it's going to be the same question in a minute, but right. Because that's,
Yes.
Who is going to do that work? Because some people may be watching this. Are they real and permanent, verifiable and enforceable?
Let me answer by
Quantifiable?
stepping back and just giving you my experience, having been in the habitat restoration field, if you will, for some time. I have viewed in that sector a persistent challenge how you ensure an appropriate amount of funding and the commitment over time to monitor. Mm-hmm. We know we're investing in really good projects. You can take our fisheries restoration grant program and we can aggregate how many dollars, which watersheds, how many roads restored, how many culverts removed. But we need to move our granting to a next level in monitoring where we're trying to understand if the individual projects are affecting species population change, and when you take all the projects in an area, whether they're achieving a better landscape scale effect. Side note, that's why I'm very excited about Proposition 1, because it has some clear direction for dedication of monitoring revenue in our habitat restoration pot of money. So what will we be doing here on these GHG projects? My expectation is we will work with the potential applicants, awardees, and try to push them into being our leading actor out in the field while they're managing the projects to monitor over time. I'm not quite sure yet how you do 50 years. There's discussion to be had. And my hope is over time, the way this is structured allows the applicants to actually begin to come to us with better proposals on the front end that include monitoring as part of the required component. We've made one of the specific scoring criterias. These things, both on the scientific merit, the basis, the prediction reductions, the additionality, and the permanence, but also that they're coming with a fleshed out monitoring plan and proposal. That's factoring into how we're ranking these projects through scoring.
Thank you for that. I guess the point of the question was just sort of showing that over time, multiple agencies, multiple projects, and some of these requirements get very complicated, and how does Air Resources Board have the ability